The forest outside Hürtgen smelled like wet iron and broken earth. November 1944 had turned the trees into skeletal sentinels, their branches clawing at a sky the color of old bruises. Private First Class Tommy Brennan crouched behind a shattered oak. His M1 Garand clutched against his chest like a prayer. The rifle was cold, heavier than it looked in the training films back in Georgia, and it had become an extension of his body over the past 3 months. 8 rounds. That's what separated him from the enemy across the ridge. 8 rounds that could fire as fast as he could pull the trigger, while the Germans worked their bolt-action Kar 98 KS like they were threading needles in a hurricane. He could hear them now, speaking in harsh whispers that carried through the frozen air. German voices, young like his own, probably scared like his own. Brennan was 22 but felt ancient. The Hürtgen Forest did that to men, aged them in ways that had nothing to do with calendars. His squad had been 12 strong when they entered this green hell 2 weeks ago. Now they are 5. The forest floor was a maze of fallen comrades, unexploded ordnance, and mud that tried to swallow your boots with every step. Sergeant Marcus Cole moved up beside him, his face a roadmap of exhaustion. Cole was from Detroit, a factory worker before the war, and he handled his M1 with the same efficiency he'd once shown on the assembly line. "Movement at 2 o'clock, Cole whispered, his breath forming small clouds. "Maybe a squad. Maybe more." Brennan nodded, tightening his grip on Garand's stock. The wood was worn smooth from countless hands before his, each soldier leaving an invisible fingerprint of fear and hope. He'd named his rifle Grace, after his kid sister back in Augusta. She'd written him letters that talked about school dances and Sunday dinners, letters that seemed to arrive from another universe entirely. The last one was tucked inside his helmet liner, the paper soft from repeated readings. The German position was roughly 50 yards ahead, nestled in a natural depression where the earth had been torn open by artillery days before. Brennan could see the glint of their helmets, the distinctive coal scuttle shape that had become synonymous with the enemy. They were setting up a machine gun nest, their movements methodical and practiced. The MG-42, the weapon the Americans called Hitler's buzzsaw, for its terrifying rate of fire. If they got that thing operational, his squad was finished. "We need to move now," Cole said, his voice tight, "before they dig in." Private Eddie Kowalski crawled up on Brennan's left, his face still bearing the pink scars from a close encounter with a grenade 3 weeks back. Eddie was from Chicago, a butcher's son who could quote Shakespeare and gut a deer with equal proficiency. His Garand had a small dent in the stock from where a German bullet had struck it instead of his chest. He called it his lucky charm. "I count 8, maybe 9, Eddie whispered. "They don't know we're here yet." That was the advantage, surprise. But it was an advantage that would evaporate the moment the first shot cracked through the frozen air. Brennan's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd been in firefights before, had felt the peculiar terror of bullets snapping past his head like invisible hornets. But fear never became routine. It just became familiar, like an unwanted houseguest who never left. Corporal James "Jimmy" Washington slipped into position on the right flank, his dark skin making him nearly invisible in the shadows. Jimmy was from Alabama, a sharecropper's son who'd enlisted to escape a life of picking cotton under a merciless sun. He carried photographs of his wife Sarah and their 2 daughters in a waterproof pouch over his heart. "They're almost done with that setup," Jimmy observed. 60 seconds, maybe less. Cole made the decision with the efficiency of a man who'd made too many like it. "On my mark. Brennan, you take the gunner. Eddie, the loader. Jimmy, sweep right. I'll go left. Parker." He glanced at the 5th member of their squad, Private Danny Parker, barely 19 with a face full of freckles and terror. "You stay here and cover our retreat if things go south." Danny nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. He was the newest replacement, having arrived just 4 days ago with eyes full of adventure and a head full of propaganda. The Hürtgen had already begun to hollow him out, carving away the illusions to reveal the raw truth underneath. The war wasn't glorious. It was cold and muddy and it smelled like death. Brennan checked his ammunition. 8 rounds in the rifle, 2 more 8-round clips in his bandolier. The M1 Garand used N-block clips that loaded from the top, a revolutionary design that made American infantry the fastest shooting soldiers in the world. When empty, the clip ejected with a distinctive ping that every GI knew intimately. Some said the Germans had learned to listen for that sound, to time their counterattacks for when American rifles ran dry. Brennan didn't know if that was true or just another piece of battlefield mythology, but he tried to time his reloads carefully anyway. The German machine gunner settled behind his weapon, adjusting the bipod. He was young, Brennan realized, probably not much older than Danny. He wore glasses that caught the weak afternoon light. A student, maybe, or a clerk, conscripted into service for a cause that was crumbling around him. For a moment, Brennan felt a strange kinship with the enemy soldier. Two young men trying to survive a war neither had started. Then Cole's hand dropped. Brennan squeezed the trigger. The M1 Garand roared, its .30-06 round crossing the distance in a fraction of a second. The German gunner jerked backward, his glasses spinning away into the mud. Brennan fired again, the semi-automatic action allowing him to acquire a second target almost instantly. The loader fell, clutching his shoulder. The German squad scattered like startled birds, diving for cover as American rounds tore through their position. Eddie's Garand joined the chorus, its distinctive bark punctuating the chaos. He fired methodically, 4 rounds in quick succession, each one aimed and deliberate. A German soldier attempting to return fire with his Kar 98K managed to work the bolt once before Eddie's bullet found him. The disparity in firepower was shocking. While the Germans fumbled with their bolt actions, the Americans poured fire into their position like a biblical flood. Jimmy Washington's rifle sank from the right flank, catching 2 Germans as they tried to retreat. Cole moved forward in a crouch, firing from the hip as he advanced, his M1 bucking against his shoulder. The Germans who survived the initial volley were trying to fight back, but their bolt-action rifles required them to break aim, work the bolt, re-aim. Precious seconds that the Americans exploited ruthlessly. Brennan emptied his first clip, the metallic ping of the ejecting en-bloc loud even amid the gunfire. His hands moved on instinct, pulling a fresh clip from his bandolier and thumbing it into the rifle's action. The bolt slammed forward, chambering the first round. 2 seconds, maybe 3. In that brief pause, a German soldier rose from cover and fired. The Kar 98K's report was deeper, angrier than the Garand's bark. The bullet snapped past Brennan's head close enough that he felt the air displacement. He returned fire immediately, 3 fast rounds that stitched across the German's chest. The soldier fell backward into the crater, his rifle clattering against the frozen ground. Brennan felt nothing. Not triumph, not guilt, just the numb acceptance of survival. There would be time for feeling later if later ever came. The firefight lasted maybe 90 seconds, though it felt like hours. When the shooting stopped, the forest returned to its oppressive silence, broken only by the ringing in Brennan's ears and the labored breathing of his squadmates. 9 German soldiers lay scattered around the machine gun nest. None moved. The MG-42 sat abandoned, its barrel still cold, never having fired a single shot. Cole surveyed the scene with grim satisfaction. "Check them," he ordered. "Weapons, ammunition, papers. Anything useful." Brennan approached the first body, the young soldier with the glasses. They lay in the mud beside him, one lens cracked. In the soldier's breast pocket, Brennan found a letter written in elegant script. German words he couldn't read, but the emotion transcended language. At the bottom was a name, Maria. A photograph accompanied it, showing a pretty girl with dark hair and a shy smile. Brennan tucked the letter back into the soldier's pocket, a small gesture of respect in a landscape devoid of it. Eddie called out from the machine gun position. "Got something." He held up a leather satchel. "Maps. Looks like operational plans." Cole examined the documents, his face hardening. "This is big. These show German positions all along this sector." He looked up at his squad. "We need to get this back to the battalion. Now." But the forest had other plans. The mortar round landed 15 feet away, its explosion throwing mud and shrapnel in a deadly arc. Brennan felt himself lifted and thrown backward, his world reduced to pressure and noise and sudden, shocking pain. He hit the ground hard, grace tumbling from his grip. His ears rang with a high, sustained note that seemed to emanate from inside his skull. Through the haze, he saw Cole shouting orders he couldn't hear. Jimmy Washington was dragging Eddie toward cover, blood streaming from Eddie's leg. Danny Parker lay motionless near a tree, his young face frozen in an expression of surprise. More mortar rounds began to fall, a steel rain that turned the forest into a killing field. Brennan's hands found grace in the mud. He pulled himself forward, his body moving through pain he didn't fully register yet. Adrenaline was a powerful drug, masking injuries that would announce themselves later, if there was a later. The German counterattack was coming. He could hear them moving through the trees, shouting commands, working their bolt-action rifles as they advanced. But they were advancing into a squad of Americans armed with M1 Garands. Cole had established a hasty defense behind a fallen log. He fired steadily, his rifle working like a metronome, boom, boom, boom. Each shot deliberate, each shot finding a target. The Germans fell back, their commanders learning the hard lesson that American infantry couldn't be rushed the way other armies could. The Garand had changed the equation of infantry combat. Brennan reached the log and added his fire to Cole's. His shoulder was wet, blood, probably his own, though he couldn't spare the attention to check. 8 rounds downrange, reload, 8 more. The Germans tried to flank, but Jimmy's Garand cut them down. They tried to suppress with machine gun fire, but Eddie, despite his wounded leg, kept them pinned with accurate counterfire. The battle evolved into a brutal exchange. The Germans had numbers, but the Americans had firepower. The Kar 98K was an excellent rifle, accurate and reliable, but it was a weapon from another era. The M1 Garand represented a fundamental shift in military technology, the democratization of rapid fire. Every GI was now a walking arsenal capable of projecting force that previous generations could only dream of. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. A German sergeant attempted to rally his men for a charge, standing exposed as he gestured forward. Brennan's bullet caught him mid-sentence, and the attack dissolved before it began. The psychological impact of facing M1-equipped infantry was as devastating as the physical casualties. German soldiers who'd been told they were superior found themselves outgunned by farm boys and factory workers. The counterattack broke after 10 minutes. The surviving Germans retreated, dragging their wounded with them, their bolt-action rifles silent. Cole's squad held their position, bleeding and exhausted but alive. Mostly alive. Danny Parker hadn't moved, and when Brennan crawled to him, he found the young soldier's eyes staring at nothing. Shrapnel had found him in that first mortar blast, killing him instantly. He'd been in the Hürtgen Forest for 4 days. "We need to move," Cole said, his voice hoarse. "More will come. They always come." The journey back to American lines took 3 hours. They moved slowly, Eddie limping between Jimmy and Brennan, Cole leading with the captured German documents. The forest watched them pass, indifferent to their suffering. Brennan held Grace close, the rifle's familiar weight a comfort. His shoulder burned now, the adrenaline wearing off to reveal a deep laceration from shrapnel. It would be scary, just another mark to add to the collection. They reached the battalion command post as twilight bled into darkness. Captain Morrison took the captured maps with barely contained excitement. "This is intelligence gold," he said, already shouting for his staff. "You boys did good." But standing there in the CP, mud-caked and blood-stained, Brennan didn't feel like he'd done good. He felt empty, hollowed out by the day's violence. They'd won the engagement, had proven again the superiority of the M1 Garand over the German bolt-actions, but Danny Parker was still dead. So were the 9 German soldiers in that crater, including the young man with glasses who'd been writing to someone named Maria. That night, in a muddy foxhole that passed for shelter, Brennan cleaned Grace with methodical care. The rifle had functioned perfectly, as it always did. 8 rounds, as fast as he could shoot them, a technological advantage that had saved his life a dozen times over. He thought about the German soldiers they'd killed, men armed with rifles that required them to break their aim with each shot, men who'd been stunned by the American firepower, men who died before they understood they were in a fight they couldn't win. Eddie sat nearby, his leg bandaged by a medic who'd promised evacuation in the morning. "You think they ever figured it out?" Eddie asked. "The Germans, you think they realize what they're up against?" "They know," Jimmy Washington replied from his own foxhole. "They learned. They just can't do anything about it. Their whole military doctrine is built around the Kar 98K. Can't just change that overnight." Cole joined them, carrying a bottle of schnapps he'd liberated from somewhere. He took a pull and passed it around. "The Garand's a game-changer," he said. "I talked to some of the intelligent boys. German prisoners all say the same thing. They call us the 8-shooters. They're terrified of American infantry now. Can't match our rate of fire. Can't close the distance before we cut them down." Brennan accepted the bottle, the alcohol burning away some of the day's cold. He thought about the German sergeant trying to rally his men, standing tall in the face of American fire like courage could stop bullets. Couldn't. The M1 Garand had proven that courage, tactics, and training all bowed before superior firepower. "Danny never got to fire a shot," Brennan said quietly. "He was just there 1 second, gone the next." Cole nodded. "That's the Hürtgen. Random as hell. Could be any of us tomorrow." He raised the bottle. "To Danny Parker. To all of them." They drank in silence. 5 soldiers who'd survived another day in the forest that 8 men whole. Around them, the Hürtgen whispered its secrets to the darkness. Stories of valor and terror, of technological superiority meeting human desperation, of 8-round clips that had revolutionized infantry warfare. The next morning, Eddie was evacuated to a field hospital. A week later, Jimmy Washington caught a sniper's bullet and died before the medics could reach him. Cole lasted until December, when a tree burst from German artillery sent splinters through his chest like wooden bullets. Brennan survived the Hürtgen, survived the Bulge, survived the Rhine crossing, and made it all the way to V-Day with grace still in his hands. Years later, in a small house in Augusta, an aging Tommy Brennan would sometimes take his M1 Garand down from where it hung above the fireplace. His grandchildren would ask about the war, and he'd tell them sanitized stories about camaraderie and adventure. But at night, alone with his memories, he'd remember the forest outside Hürtgen, the young German with glasses writing to Maria, the distinct ping of an en-bloc clip ejecting, the way 8 rounds had made all the difference between living and dying. The M1 Garand had stunned the German infantry with its firepower. But war had stunned them all, victor and vanquished alike, with its capacity for turning young men into ghosts and rifles into the instruments of history. The weapon that had given America a tactical advantage became a symbol of the conflict itself. Efficient, deadly, and ultimately impersonal. 8 rounds fired while the enemy worked a bolt. 8 chances to live while they struggled to reload. 8 bullets between survival and a letter home that began, "We regret to inform you." Brennan kept grace for the rest of his life. A steel and wood reminder that technology could save you, but it couldn't erase what you'd seen or who you'd lost. The rifle hung silent above the fireplace, its 8-round clip forever empty, its deadly song finally stilled. But in the quiet moments, when memory overrode the present, Tommy Brennan could still hear it singing. The distinctive bark of the M1 Garand, the weapon that had stunned an enemy and defined a generation. The war had ended decades ago, but grace remained, a testament to the soldiers who'd carried her sisters into battle, who'd trusted their lives to 8 rounds and a semi-automatic action, who'd proven that in the brutal arithmetic of infantry combat, fire superiority wrote the equations in blood. And somewhere in Germany, perhaps, an old woman named Maria kept a letter that never received a reply, written by a young soldier with glasses who'd fallen in a forest he'd never wanted to fight in, killed by one of those 8 rounds, another casualty of the rifle that had changed warfare forever. Spring 1945 brought a different kind of silence to Europe. The guns had fallen quiet, their thunder replaced by birdsong and the tentative sounds of rebuilding. Tommy Brennan stood in a displaced persons camp outside Munich, grace slung across his back with familiar weight. The war had officially ended 3 weeks ago, but peace felt like a foreign country he was still learning to navigate. The camp was a sprawling collection of tents and hastily erected buildings, housing thousands of refugees, concentration camp survivors, former forced laborers, displaced civilians who no longer had homes to return to. Brennan's company had been assigned to security and aid distribution, a strange transition from soldiers to something closer to social workers with rifles. He watched a line of children receiving food rations, their hollow eyes tracking every movement with practiced wariness. One boy, maybe 7 years old, caught Brennan's attention. The child stared at Grace with an expression that mixed fear and fascination. When Brennan smiled and nodded, the boy didn't smile back. He'd seen too much for smiles. "It never gets easier, does it?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Harold Moss, a West Point graduate who'd joined the company during the push into Germany. Moss was young for an officer, 25 but weathered by months of combat. Looking at what was done here, Brennan shook his head. They'd liberated 2 concentration camps during the final advance. The sights, the skeletal prisoners, the mass graves, the systematic horror of it all had recontextualized everything he'd experienced in the Hürtgen Forest and beyond. The Germans they'd killed with their M1 Garands had been soldiers, yes, but they'd also been components in a machine of unprecedented evil. "My grandfather fought in the Great War," Moss continued. "He used to tell me about the trenches, about charging machine gun nests with bolt-action rifles. Said the carnage was biblical." He gestured toward Brennan's Garand. He'd have given anything for a weapon like that. 8 rounds, semi-automatic. Would have saved thousands of lives on both sides. Ended the war faster. "Maybe," Brennan said. "Or maybe we'd have just found more efficient ways to kill each other." A jeep arrived carrying medical supplies, and Brennan helped unload boxes. The work was mundane but necessary, a welcome change from the hypervigilance of combat. His shoulder still ached where the shrapnel had torn through muscle. The medics had patched him up, but he'd carry the scar forever. Most days he forgot about it. Some days, when the weather changed, it reminded him of the forest, of Danny Parker's lifeless eyes, of the German soldiers' glasses lying in the mud. That evening, Brennan sat cleaning Grace by lamplight in the barracks. The routine was meditative: disassemble, clean each component, oil the action, reassemble. He'd performed this ritual hundreds of times, knew every part intimately. The rifle had never failed him, not once. The M1's reliability had become legendary among American troops. While German and Soviet weapons jammed in the cold or mud, the Garand kept functioning. Eddie Kowalski's last letter sat on Brennan's footlocker. Eddie had survived his leg wound, had been sent back to Chicago with a limp and a Purple Heart. His letter described working at his father's butcher shop again, trying to readjust to civilian life, struggling with nightmares about the Hürtgen Forest. "I woke up reaching for my rifle," Eddie wrote. "Sarah says I call out in my sleep, shouting about incoming mortars. Is it the same for you?" It was. Every soldier Brennan knew struggled with the transition. They'd been trained to react to threats with overwhelming firepower, and had survived by embracing violence as a tool. Now they were expected to set down that tool and pretend it had never become part of their identity. The M1 Garand had made them effective killers. Peace demanded they become something else. A commotion outside drew Brennan from his thoughts. He grabbed Grace instinctively, old habits dying hard, and stepped into the cool evening air. A group of former German soldiers, now prisoners of war working in the camp, had gathered near the fence. They weren't causing trouble, just talking among themselves, smoking the cigarettes American guards had given them. One of them noticed Brennan and his rifle. The former German soldier, a sergeant, based on the faded insignia still visible on his ragged uniform, said something to his companions in German. They all looked at the M1 Garand with expressions Brennan couldn't quite read. Respect, resentment, fear. Lieutenant Moss appeared beside Brennan. "Do you speak any German, Private?" "No, sir," he said. "That's the rifle that beat us." Moss nodded toward the German sergeant. "I asked him about it during an interrogation last week. He was at Normandy and fought all the way back to the Rhine. Said the worst part wasn't the tanks or the artillery, it was facing American infantry. Said every GI seemed to have unlimited ammunition, that their Kar 98 KS felt like antiques by comparison. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel." Brennan studied the German sergeant. The man was gaunt, hollow-eyed, probably in his 30s but looking older. A survivor like Brennan himself. The sergeant said something else, his tone neither angry nor admiring, just matter-of-fact. He says they called it the 8-shooter, Moss translated. Says it changed everything. Their officers kept telling them German quality and training would overcome American firepower, but, he shrugged. Numbers don't lie. You can outshoot a man with a bolt action when you've got a semi-automatic. Simple as that. The German sergeant caught Brennan's eye and nodded slowly, a gesture of acknowledgement between soldiers. Then he turned away, rejoining his companions. The conversation moved on to other topics: home, food, the uncertain future. The war was over, but its consequences would echo for decades. Back in the barracks, Brennan finished cleaning Grace and returned her to his footlocker. Soon he'd be going home, leaving Europe behind, trading his rifle for whatever life awaited him in Augusta. His sister's letters painted a picture of normalcy, the town unchanged, his job at the textile mill still waiting, life continuing as if the war had been a brief interruption rather than a catastrophic upheaval. But Brennan had changed. The boy who'd left Georgia in 1943 had died somewhere in the Hürtgen Forest. The man who'd survived carried memories that wouldn't fade, skills that had no civilian application, and an intimate familiarity with violence that couldn't be unlearned. The M1 Garand had given him a tactical advantage over the enemy. It had also bound him to a brotherhood of combat veterans who would never fully integrate back into the society they'd left behind. 2 months later, Brennan stood on the deck of a Liberty ship, watching the European coastline disappear into the Atlantic horizon. Grace was packed in his duffel, approved for veterans to bring home as souvenirs. Around him, hundreds of soldiers celebrated their departure. The war behind them, home ahead. But their cheers sounded hollow to Brennan's ears, haunted by absent voices. Cole, Jimmy, Danny, and thousands of others who'd boarded ships heading east but would never board ships heading west. The M1 Garand had stunned German infantry with its firepower. 8 rounds versus 5, semi-automatic versus bolt action, American industrial might versus German military tradition. The rifle had changed infantry combat fundamentally and had given the United States a decisive tactical advantage that helped win the European theater. Military historians would analyze it, veterans would praise it, and future generations would revere it as one of World War II's most significant weapons. But for Tommy Brennan, standing on that ship watching Europe fade, the rifle represented something more personal and more painful. It was the tool that had kept him alive while better men died. It was the companion through frozen forests and burning towns. It was 8 rounds between existence and oblivion, between writing letters home and becoming a name on a telegram. He thought about the German with glasses, about Maria's letter tucked in a dead man's pocket, about the peculiar tragedy of young men killing each other over ideologies they barely understood. The M1 Garand hadn't made killing moral or necessary, it had simply made it efficient. 8 rounds, as fast as you could pull the trigger, each one erasing someone's son, brother, father, or friend. The ship's horn sounded, a deep bellow that carried across the water. America was 10 days away, a lifetime, a world apart from the battlefields he was leaving behind. Brennan pulled out Eddie's letter and read it again, focusing on the last paragraph. "We did what we had to do, Tommy. We survived when others didn't. Now we have to figure out how to live with that. Come visit when you get home. We'll talk about something other than the war, even if we both know the war is all we can think about." In his footlocker, Grace rested silent and clean, her job done. The rifle that had stunned German infantry with its semi-automatic fury was returning home. Another veteran trying to find peace in a world that would never fully understand what it had done or what had been done with it. 8 rounds had made all the difference in combat. Now Brennan had to discover what would make a difference in peace. The Atlantic stretched vast and gray before the ship, and Tommy Brennan stood at the railing with memories heavier than any rifle, wondering if home would feel like home to a man who'd learned that 8 rounds could change everything, except the weight of using them.